Why 15 minutes of fame was a 90s death sentence. The disposable icons. There is a graveyard in Hollywood that no one visits. It's not filled with the legends we've discussed before. The men like Eastwood or Wayne, who fought the system and won. No, this graveyard is filled with the 15-minute kings. In the early 1990s, the film industry stopped building stars and started harvesting them. They stopped looking for talent that could last 40 years and started looking for faces that could burn for 40 weeks. If you grew up in the 90s, you remember the feeling of a new face appearing every single Monday. One day, a kid from an indie film was on the cover of every magazine. The next, he was the face of a $100 million franchise. It felt like progress. It felt like the old guard was finally letting the new generation in. But looking back at the data and the debris left behind, we can see the truth. It was a corporate extraction. The industry had discovered a way of manufacturing fame at high speed. Use it to sell a summer slate, and then, crucially, dispose of the person once the profit was secured. They were called the next big thing, but in the boardroom, they were called variable costs. We are talking about the men who were handed the keys to the kingdom, only to realize the locks had been changed the moment they tried to step back inside. This isn't just a story about fading fame, it's a story about industrial betrayal. Today, we're exposing the mechanics of the quick burn and how the 90s star machine ensured that the most famous men in the world would be forgotten before the decade was even over. The Clone Wars. The Skeet Ulrich experiment. To understand how the machine works, you have to look at the clone theory. By 1995, Johnny Depp had become the ultimate industrial blueprint. He was the alternative leading man, sensitive, edgy, and wildly profitable. But the studios had a problem. Johnny Depp was an artist. He was famously difficult to control. He preferred the fringes, and he was expensive. The conglomerates that now owned the studios hated unpredictability. They didn't want a partner, they wanted a product. Enter the hunt for the budget Depp. In 1996, the industry found their candidate, in Skeet Ulrich. Between Scream and The Craft, Ulrich had marketed with a ferocity that was almost violent. He had the cheekbones, the dark hair, and the intense, wounded eyes that the industry had decided was the currency of the decade. But here is the secret the public wasn't supposed to know. The industry didn't want Skeet Ulrich to be a great actor. They wanted him to be a placeholder. The strategy was simple. If the original star is too expensive or demands too much creative control, you activate the clone. You saturate the market with his face until the audience can't tell the difference. But the moment Ulrich tried to show range, the moment he tried to do the kind of character work that builds a 40-year career, the machine ground to a halt. The clone is only valuable as long as it stays in the box he was built in. Ulrich wasn't failed by his talent. He was failed by a marketing department that viewed him as a seasonal inventory item. The second the industry felt they had enough of that specific look, or the second the real Depp became more manageable, Ulrich was deleted. He didn't lose his it factor. He was simply disconnected from the power grid.
Sold before you get out of prison.
The Cool Extraction. The Stephen Dorff Sacrifice. In the mid-90s, cool became a measurable commodity. With the rise of the Sundance film scene, the studios realized they could buy street cred by poaching indie actors and dropping them into corporate blockbusters. They wanted the grime and authenticity of the independent world to rub off on their generic action movies. Stephen Dorff was the ultimate prize in this hunt. After his performance in Backbeat, Dorff was the indie prince. He had a raw, unpolished charisma that felt dangerous in an era of manufactured boy bands. Naturally, Hollywood came calling, with a massive check for a movie called Blade. Now, pay attention to the trap. Blade was a massive success. It arguably birthed the modern superhero era. But in the 90s, if a blockbuster was a hit, the industry credited the brand. They credited the explosions, the IP, and the special effects. But if a movie was ever a minor disappointment, or if the star didn't immediately become a household name on the level of Tom Cruise, they blamed the new guy. Dorff was caught in a pincer movement. The indie world viewed him as a sellout for doing a vampire movie. The studio world viewed him as replaceable because the Blade brand was bigger than his name. This is the modular star mechanic. The industry used Dorff's indie credibility to launch a franchise, and once the franchise was airborne, they didn't need the pilot anymore. They moved on to the next Sundance darling to repeat the process. It was a cycle of extraction. Hollywood mine an actor for their cool, use it up until the person felt generic, and then leave the actor's career in a state of collapse. The system wasn't designed for Dorff to succeed. It was designed for the IP to succeed through him. By the time the 90s ended, a dozen indie icons had been chewed up by this machine and spat back out into an industry that no longer remembered why they were cool in the first place. The corporate erasure, the Speed 2 disaster, and the modular star. By 1997, the corporate suits, who had taken over the major studios, reached a cold-blooded conclusion. They decided that the star was an obsolete concept. For 100 years, the talent held the leverage. If a movie was a hit, the actor got the raise. The conglomerates, the beverage companies, and tech giants who now owned the backlots hated this. They wanted a system where the brand was the hero, and the human being was a component. This was the birth of the modular star, and Jason Patric was their first major victim. Patric was a powerhouse. He had the brooding, classic leading man energy we've discussed before on this channel. He was respected, intense, and ready for a decades-long career. But when he was cast in Speed 2, Cruise Control, he wasn't being hired to act. He was being hired to prove a corporate theory, that you could plug any handsome man into a sequel and the audience wouldn't care. But here is the trap. When the movie failed, the industry didn't look at the weak script or the absurdity of a slow-moving boat. They didn't blame the corporate greed that rushed the production. They put the entire failure on Jason Patric. They used him as a human shield for a corporate disaster. They decided he didn't have it, effectively blacklisting a world-class talent to protect their own reputations. The industry didn't lose a star in 1997. They intentionally broke one to prove that no human was bigger than the logo. The expire date. The Edward Furlong betrayal. If you want to see the true cruelty of the 90s machine, you have to look at Edward Furlong. In 1991, he wasn't just an actor. He was a cultural nerve endings. As John Connor, he represented a generation of kids who felt abandoned. Hollywood didn't just market his face, they marketed his soul. They extracted every ounce of rebellion and angst they could to sell tickets. But Hollywood has a hidden expiration date for its youth. They knew how to sell Furlong as a child, but they had zero interest in supporting him as a man. As Furlong grew older, his intensity, the very thing that made him a star, became a liability. The studios were moving toward a polished millennium. They wanted clean, safe, corporate-friendly faces. They wanted the edge, without the actual person. While Furlong was delivering a masterpiece in American History X, the industry was already auditioning his replacement. When the pressures of his environment, a system that offered zero support for the young people it exploited, began to show, the industry didn't help. They simply stopped calling. They had drained the well dry. They discarded him like outdated technology, leaving a brilliant artist to navigate the wreckage of a career they had used up and then set on fire. It wasn't a downfall, it was a planned obsolescence. the tabloid weaponization, and the end of the middle. We cannot talk about the erasure of these men without exposing the tabloid synergy. In the late 90s, the paparazzi became a professional weapon. If an actor like Skeet Ulrich or Stephen Dorff tried to negotiate for more money, or if they pushed back against a bad script, the media narrative would suddenly flip. One day they were the next big thing. The next, they were difficult, troubled, or washed up. The studios realized that if a star was perceived as a liability in the tabloids, they could be hired for less or dropped entirely with no public outcry. It was the ultimate system of control. The very people being worked to exhaustion were mocked for showing the signs of it. The final blow was the death of the mid-budget movie. In the 90s, an actor could build a legacy on $20 million dramas. These were the films that allowed for growth. But when the conglomerates took over, they deleted the middle. Suddenly, you were either in a $200 million franchise or you didn't exist. Men like Chris O'Donnell, who excelled in human-scale roles, found themselves in a desert. The industry hadn't just changed the rules, they had removed the playing field entirely. The grit of the survivors. So how do we remember the 15-minute kings? We shouldn't see them as failures. We should see them as survivors. The 90s was a corporate frontier, and like any frontier, it was a place of extreme violence. These men were hunted, used, and discarded by a machine that never intended them to grow old. On this channel, we talk about the grit it takes to endure. Some of the greatest grit we see isn't from the legends who stayed at the top, but from the men who were cast aside and still found a way to keep their souls intact. They were the quick burn, but the light they provided defined an entire era. They remind us that fame is a temporary contract, but character is permanent. The industry failed them by treating them as products, but we remember them as people. If you want to see how the survivors of this era finally found their footing, check out our deep dive on the 90s leading men. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe. See you in the next video.